By the end of this module, you'll be able to install and configure a Unitrends appliance. The deployment process differs for physical and virtual appliances. Let's take a look. The Unitrends virtual appliance, the Unitrends Backup, can be installed on Hyper-V, VMware, and Xen Server. Now, in these configurations, you create the hypervisor and provide the required CPU, RAM, and storage, depending on your needs. Now, it's recommended to use the install wizard to complete the network setup if you're installing the virtual appliances. With our recovery series, our physical appliances, the CPU, RAM, and storage are included. You can see the Unitrends appliance family datasheet for more information and additional options if you need to. Once again, these little links here can be used to pull up web pages or resources that you can view and find additional information. Here's our recovery series appliance family datasheet. Now, you cannot set up these using the install wizard for the network. You have to connect to a KVM or a console to complete that network setup. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail as we keep going. Once again, you can also watch the install onboarding sessions. Those are over in the quick demos and top resources on the Unitrends website. If you log into your account on the Unitrends website as a customer or a partner, and you go to your training area, and if you go to your catalog out here, you'll see quick demos and top resources. There's the install onboarding sessions. These sessions take about an hour to watch all of them. And it's a great overview of how to install either a physical or virtual appliance from the ground up. Okay, that's also available to you. You can go back and watch that if you need to. Let's take a look at installing and configuring new appliances. To set up your appliance, you're going to need to make sure you prepare your environment. If you have a recovery series, our physical appliance, you're going to need to make sure you have rack space. You're going to verify your power requirements based on your single or dual power supplies. Right? You're going to connect the network ports and run your cabling. You got to make sure all that's in place. If you look at the Unitrends Backup, the virtual appliances, you need to make sure you have a hypervisor with the recommended CPU, RAM, and storage to fit that virtual appliance and your needs for storage as well, too. You can also go back and review that install onboarding once again, because it really helps. It's a great overview for understanding what you might need. Once again, you're also going to install the Unitrends Backup. It's the pre-installed software on the recovery series. You're going to create that virtual appliance running that software as well, too, as a virtual machine on your host. Now, you're going to configure your appliance, your ETH0. That's included with the UB install in that wizard. That's why we recommend running the wizard, because it's running you through setting up your network right from the start. If you use an OVA template or something different, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. You may want to come back and use the back end of the console, the KVM. Now, once you configure the IP address on ETH0, you're going to use that IP address through your web browser, and you're going to continue the setup and configuration. And once again, there are these little icons in this document that you can use to pull up resources. This one links directly to the admin guide, right to navigating the user interface. Some additional resources you may want to go through and make sure you understand. Some pretty cool stuff. If you're installing UB on a hypervisor, you want to make sure you run your UB appliance and protected VMs on different hosts. Don't put all your eggs in that one basket. Make sure you're installing it on a supported version, too. For VMware, there's ESX 5.1, 5.5, and 6. Currently today for Hyper-V, there's Server 2008, 2012, 2012 R2 SP1. And for Xen Server version 6.2, 6.5, and 7. And once again, with all new releases, check the release notes. Check for when these things change, because we do have some changes coming here in the near future for VMware, supporting 6.5 already. Now, you also want to make sure you allocate recommended resources. This is very important. Want to make sure you have at least a minimum of 2 CPUs, 4 gigabytes of RAM, and 100 gigabytes of space for VM's initial disk, just the OS basically. And to start with, at least 170 gigabytes of backup storage for the initial install. You're going to expand that backup storage hopefully by terabytes, depending on how much data capacity you need to protect. All right, we're going to learn a little bit more of that as we go through these modules in detail as well. Now, there's also a rule of thumb you want to follow. For every concurrent connection you plan on using on your virtual appliance, you should have 1 CPU and 4 gigabytes of RAM. Now, our default concurrent connections is set up for 10. So you should have more CPU and more RAM than our minimum of, or default of 2 and 4. So either make sure you go into the UI and lower your concurrent connections, or give it more processor and memory by default when you deploy your first virtual appliance to match your 10 concurrent connections. And if you plan on running 10 backups at a time, then you need to up your processor and memory. Those backups will underperform. Now, if we look at the network requirements, depending on your needs, you may need to configure the following. Right, if your current network is using 10.10.10.1 on 255.255.255.0, you want to make sure you boot that new appliance, whether it's physical or virtual, with a network cable either offline or unplugged. Right? You want to make sure you assign the new IP to the UB or Youth0 under the console before re-enabling or reconnecting that network and booting that appliance back up. It's very important. You will take over a network if they're using that 10.10.10.1. Now, if you have a firewall between your appliances and your protected assets, you want to make sure you have the ports 1743 and 1745 open for bidirectional traffic. That's if you have a firewall between your appliance and your protected assets. If you purchase Unitrend support services, which most people do, you also want to make sure you open up port 222 for our Unitrend support access, our support tunnel. That way, when you need help, we can remote in and take over and help you solve your problems and give you some assistance and guidance. Now, you will configure additional network settings during your install, including IP address, subnet, gateway, DNS. You know, that all that stuff needs to be configured if you need to run updates. You want to run updates and get the newest Unitrends release on your appliance, which is really important as well, too. When we look at hypervisor installation requirements, your installation packages may vary based on your hypervisor version. Make sure you're checking your deployment guides. Right, VMware uses EXE installers. They're for the paid versions, and the OVA template you can even use on the free only. Right. Now, Hyper-V uses EXE installers or the ISO images. Once again, check the versioning there depending on what you're running. And Zen Server uses the XVA template to deploy the virtual appliances. There is no installer for Zen Server. Now, if you talk to most installers or most people that deploy these appliances, they tend to use the OVA templates for VMware and the ISO image for Hyper-V, because directly from the template or the image, they seem to deploy faster and you have a little bit more control over it. Once again, you don't get the luxuries of running the wizards where you set your network up front, but it is a little bit more configurable to run through the OVA and the ISO image installers. Now, if you're running from an EXE from Windows machine, you need to make sure you enable the .NET framework for 3.5 using add roles and features. You also need to make sure that .NET Framework 4 is running too. You also want to make sure you use Firefox or Chrome browser to access the UI. Internet Explorer is currently not supported. When we look at determining your UB storage strategy, it's really important that you select with care, as you cannot change these selections after the initial install. Once you give an appliance that piece of storage, it's there as part of the storage pool until that whole pool is gone or the appliance is gone. Now, you can add additional storage of the same type over time, so you want to start slow. Don't just give it everything you got. Now, when you're talking about a physically added disk, the virtual machine disk that it's on has to either be a DAS internal to that hypervisor or external SAN or NAS connected directly to that hypervisor host as well too. When you're talking about external storage, when you're talking about a SAN on a LUN connected to that VM over iSCSI, there's a KV article there, 3350, a link that can help you out with more information. Or it needs to be a NAS share connected directly over to that VM over CIFS or NFS. Okay, now once again, you can see the deployment guides for VMware, Hyper-V, and Zen Server. There's a link down there for you as well too in that document for more details if you're going in one of those directions. When you start to configure your appliance, you're going to set up your UB host name. You're going to add that network configuration, the IP address, DNS, gateway. You're going to set your date and time settings. You're going to upgrade to the newest Unitrends release, and you're going to add your storage. Make sure your appliance is up and running with the basics first. Then you're going to start to add and register your assets. You can view that asset management lecture for more information on how to add your individual assets, tying to VMware, Hyper-V, your Windows, your Linux clients, through the agents, your NASs, through CIFS or NFS. Once again, you always want to make sure when you're doing your basic rounds and your first initial configuration of your appliances that you're changing your console, your OS root password as well too. Don't leave those set as the default. You're going to add, if you're doing any virtual appliances, you're going to add any Unitrends licenses. Once again, the physical appliances, they come pre-licensed, our recovery series. One of the last things you're going to do is add your additional web user interfaces. You want to get out of the habit of using that root password all the time or that root account all the time. Secure that root account and create additional super users for your individual users in your groups, or manage accounts or monitor accounts, whatever you're going to use. We'll see some more of that stuff when we get into the tutorials later on as well too. Now, when we talk about configuring your storage, you need to determine the amount you wish to use for backups. And you're going to reserve some of that for instant recovery. Now, you configure that after the initial deployment too. All right, some considerations down here for us is that if we're dealing with the recovery series, that comes with a set amount of backup storage. You can't expand those. All right. If you're dealing with UB backup, you can always expand that storage on the backside. When you do, you want to make sure that doing your initial deployment, that the initial backup storage was created using either a virtual attached disk direct to a SAN or a LUN, or it's direct NAS share. Make sure you're also using thick provision lazy zero. That's the best configuration to use for that new disk, or that disk configuration as well too. Now, you can also use the appliance to store backup copies from other appliances. But if it's running UB on VMware, Hyper-V, or Zen Server, an appliance can be either a backup appliance or a backup target. It cannot be both. It's one or the other, not both. Now, if you're dealing with our recovery series appliances, our physical appliances, the appliance can be both. It can be a backup appliance and a backup copy target. Now, the backup appliances storage, the backup storage is used to store the backup copies from other systems. So if you have a physical appliance that you're using for both personalities, you have to make sure that you have enough storage to keep both backups and backup copies from other appliances. That's basically what I just said, is you need to verify and configure your system with sufficient storage to balance your short-term and long-term retention goals. Your short-term is your local backup copies, and your long-term would be your retention. How much are you going to keep for your backup copies? Now, when we talk about configuring additional backup storage, we can add backup storage to UEB in the same manner as the initial backup storage. Very important. Do not modify the existing virtual disk. Instead, you always want to create a new disk. Don't go in and make one bigger. Add a new disk every time. All right? And don't use storage vMotion for VMware or live migration for Hyper-V. You just want to add the disk to the virtual host and let it go through its normal configuration. Don't try to add it to another host somewhere else and then move it to the virtual appliance and do all that stuff. You want to make sure you add additional resources to the UEB virtual machine. Once again, CPU and memory, depending on your concurrent connections. How many backup and recovery jobs do you plan on running at once? You need to make sure you add and shut down your appliances and add those additional resources. Give it more CPU, more memory if you need to. For your initial storage type for your virtual attached disk, there's some recommendations down there. You want to make sure you add the virtual disk to the UEB VM via the host. Once again, you want to expand the initial backup storage through the UI to include that new disk that you just added to the host itself. Right? That way, Unitrends can see the disk on the Unitrends side. If you're going to connect to a NAS share, then it's attached to a host using NFS or a SAN LUN connected to the host directly. You want to once again add it in the same manner. You want to once again expand the initial backup storage to include the new VMDK or the VHDX disk. That's done once again through the Unitrends UI. You add it to the host or the guest through the host. Then you add it through the UI and expand the initial backup storage. If you're going to a SAN or NAS directly attached to the UEB appliance itself, expansion is not supported. Once again, LUNs or shares can be added to the appliance as separate storage areas. In other words, you can add another backup resource, but you can't expand the initial backup storage pool, which is really what we recommend. Take advantage of the deduplication going across all the backups in that storage pool, that storage area. We talked about it earlier. You want to make sure you change that OS root user password. You want to manually change the default OS root password on every appliance. You also need to make sure you share this OS password with support via the Unitrends support tunnel if you're going to use that support tunnel service. Some people may have a complex password that they reset during a support tunnel issue, and they'll reset it back to the complex one, sharing a more simple password with the Unitrends support team. When you talk about adding Unitrends licenses to your appliances, starting with the virtual appliances, they're deployed without a license. After deployment, you need to register your asset or activate your purchase from Unitrends to keep running updates. After 15 days, your updates are going to stop. If they're a recovery series appliance, it's fully shipped with a license. There's no need to modify unless you're told directly to do so by support or sales through support via the channel. You purchase something different, some different license key for doing something different, or you add storage or change your capacity, you may need to change your license. Right? That's done for the virtual appliances. With support for physical appliances, you really will never modify that license string unless they tell you to do so. Now, applying a license change on your appliance, no matter which version, will stop all running jobs. It will cancel the job. You want to make sure the first thing you do before you make any licensing changes is check your queue, check your job active queue, and make sure you don't have any active jobs running. That includes backup copies, by the way. You want to make sure you configure your email alerts and reporting, too. The appliance can use your SMTP server to send system job alerts and failure reports via email. Now, to set this up, you need to make sure you have a fully qualified SMTP server name or its IP address. And if a DNS record has not been configured, you must use the IP address of the SMTP server. You also have to have a username and password credentials if you have an externally hosted SMTP server that requires authentication. You also want to make sure you run a valid email address test as well, too. Make sure you get that welcome message from the appliance. You also want to make sure you have destination email addresses to receive those reports, too. You also want to make sure you add web interface users on each appliance you manage, too. Make sure you can get to all of them. The accounts can only access the appliances for which they're created. And it's important for audit history when they make configuration changes and delete backups and are doing things on there that you have the ability to track those different users. Now, there's 3 different account types that you can create or levels of security that you can use to create. There's a super, user, and administrator. They can monitor and manage systems and edit and add users, delete users, everything. There's the manage role, which can view status and status reports, start and view backup jobs, and perform management tasks. They can modify their own personal account and password information. There's also the lowest level, which is the monitor account, which can view status of operations and jobs. They can run certain reports, but they can't create or start any jobs or configure anything on the system. It's very important that when assigning roles to Active Directory, it's now supported in the new user interface too. A few system configuration best practices. You want to make sure you secure your system. Go to Edit and Configure to get to that menu. Go to Change the root user password. Make sure you do that. Set up your own user account. Make sure you configure those email alerts. And be sure to set up the appliance to time servers for consistency across your environment. For long-term retention, make sure your backup copies are set to an off-site target, whether they're cold or hot. You're going to learn about that as we keep going through these modules as well, too. And also, make sure you keep your encryption passphrase. If you lose your passphrase, there's nothing we can do to help you recover that. So what's next? You want to make sure you complete the configuration wizard and view additional resources below as needed. You can also watch the asset management lecture next.